Kia ora, and welcome back to Winning Voice, the podcast series brought to you by the Ethics Conversation and made possible by Report It Now. Today we have a very special guest, Jackie Garrick. Jackie is a whistleblower herself. From the lessons she learned in her own experiences, Jackie has set out to help others. She is the founder and president of Whistleblowers of America. Jackie will speak about the founding of the organization, some of the lessons she's learned along the way, and also about the lexicon she's developed to help others identify what retribution actually is in the workplace. I invite you to listen in, and at the end of the podcast, we'll share some links that will take you to some further information from Whistleblowers of America that may help you if you're an individual looking to help an organization embed a better speak-up culture, or if you're a whistleblower, how you can find safety in finding your voice. Now, let's hear from Jackie. Jackie, thank you very much for joining the Winning Voice podcast series. You've got an amazing story to tell, and I thought we'd just jump straight into it. You are the founder of Whistleblowers of America, which is a growing organization. I'll let you tell the listeners what it's all about, but I thought we'd start first with your journey, why you saw a need for Whistleblowers of America.
Sure. So I started my own whistleblowing journey while I was working at the Pentagon. I felt like I found instances of a conflict of interest with contracting money for suicide prevention. I made my first disclosure, and my life changed drastically after that. I began to try to understand these prohibited personnel practices, as they call them, and wanted to find other people I can talk to get advice, to understand before I hired an attorney, filed further complaints. And I just couldn't find anybody easily without sort of having to have these backroom secret conversations. I wanted to connect with people who understood me and my experience, and just found that difficult. And so started to reach out to other people who were connecting me with other people and other people. And that's how this idea for a network grew.
Clearly, your experience had a profound personal, emotional and physical other impact on you. I wonder if you could talk about that. It's quite an
Sure.
honor and a privilege to talk to an actual whistleblower here who's lived the experience.
Yeah, so I'm a Army officer by background. I have spent probably the better part of 30 plus years working with veterans with combat trauma, post-traumatic stress, depression, suicidal ideation. And when I started to enter into this whistleblowing journey, and I did start to connect with other people, and I was having some of my own nightmares, my own intrusive thoughts, that ruminating that comes with being gaslit, which we can certainly talk more about. But those symptoms and those feelings I found to be quite profound, and began to see the similarities between whistleblowers who are dealing with these hostile work environment situations and combat veterans who are really struggling with post-deployment health, coming out of this battle. And they were saying, and I was hearing some of the same kinds of language, in a battle for my life, a fight for my life. I had one woman who called it being professionally gang raped, and she had gone through her whistleblowing experience 20 years before. She had reinvented her career. She was doing well, but still felt like a rape survivor because her identity had been stripped away from her, and she felt like everything she had worked for to become was lost, and somebody took that away from her.
So if anyone could have had the tools to have dealt with this sort of situation, you're in the army, the military background, educated, and you found it really tough.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I was struggling to find the right people to talk to. I initially went to EAP, an employment assistance program specialist. I went to my own therapist. I found somebody I knew who specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder, mostly, again, working with combat vets, but victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, anybody who's been emotionally abused, persecuted, can relate to this kind of a trauma. And it took my going through some of my own therapy, dealing with my own process, connecting with other people, that I found helpful. And when it was that peer connection that to me was the real active ingredient, because all of a sudden you don't feel so alone, you don't feel so isolated. There are other people who truly do understand you. And that sense of, no, I'm not crazy. This is a real thing. It's really happening to me, becomes a very active ingredient in the healing and the being resilient.
But what was it that sparked your desire then to help others?
So I think it was a process that's sort of born out of making those connections. And then honestly, I mean, it was one day I had connected with a law enforcement officer through LinkedIn, and she told me that she had her service revolver out on her table before we started to talk, and that now she felt like she had the courage to put it away and face life. So that made me feel like this is everything I know. This is everything I've known about combat trauma, about suicide, post-traumatic stress, people who are depressed. We need each other. We need to be able to find each other. So I called an attorney and I said, we need to do this, incorporate Whistleblowers of America for me. And he helped me do that. And we started the organization again in 2017 is when we really put boots on the ground and started to connect with each other.
Right, so one of the key tenets of it is that it is a peer support network for others, for people who have a story to tell. I wonder if you could share a little bit about how that's set up and how many people you've helped and been involved with since 2017.
Yeah, no, it's been an incredible journey. Honestly, I really thought in the beginning it was going to be like a lean-in circle. Me and 12 people would get together for a cup of coffee and we'd talk about our cases. But it did not take long after we put up a website and started to do some interviews with media that people started to find us through social media, find us through our Facebook page, our website. And we have now grown to like over 800 people that we've connected with. It is a very informal, voluntary network. We have what we think of as our code of ethics that we always share with everybody, and we ask them to be mindful of this. And we connect people with other people. We sort of have a way of filtering through, are these government people? Are they private sector? Are they all military? What is their commonality? For example, like I have one person I had connected with who was a corrections officer in South Carolina. I was able to connect her to another correction officer in Ohio who was having similar issues. We can connect nurses to nurses, physicians to physicians. Anytime we see a commonality, sometimes it's based on where they are. I had one woman who was Asian American, and she said she was being bullied at work because of her accent. She wanted to talk to another Asian American. So I connected them, even though their cases weren't 100% the same, although I think they both ended up working in the medical profession. But we reached out to each of them, asked if they would want to make a connection, and they've been able to connect and support each other. And we see story after story after story where those connections are really positive and people are grateful to have somebody that understands them, that they can talk to. And then we started the Workplace Promise Institute as our conference, as our training. We've come up with like 10 hours of what we feel are the basics, the bare bone basic of what we think we would want whistleblowers to know about whistleblowing, about peer support, and about how to make referrals and identify all the tools and techniques that go into whistleblowing.
You talked about commonalities among the people who have suffered retribution through wanting to tell their story. Have you noticed any commonalities in the catalyst? What has caused a problem that has put the lid on someone speaking up?
So I think that sort of takes the conversation into why do organizations retaliate?
Yes.
And I think that what we find is that there's this knee-jerk reaction to hearing bad news, right? As soon as we dismiss it. Oh, you were probably not right. You can't be, not us. I mean, as whistleblowers, we go through that internally as well. Like, did I really just see and hear what I heard and saw? Could my organization possibly be involved in something like that? And then, of course, it's a matter of sort of weeding through that process so that people understand, well, what is really happening here? And organizations shut down. I mean, I was just reading Bruce Sackman's book, Behind the Murder Curtain, where he talks about medical serial killers and how they can kill hundreds of patients before anybody steps up or does anything about it, because of this idea that we're loyal to each other. It's going to be more trouble than it's worth to investigate. We don't want to lose shareholders. We don't want to lose customers. So the administrations are more apt to not want to talk about these things than talk about them, for fear that talking about them is going to make them worse, instead of, in our opinion, talking about these things is an opportunity to fix them and make them better. That's why we call our education program the Workplace Promise, because we really want to emphasize that this is really about the right doing, and that you want to encourage the right doing.
So Whistleblowers of America has developed a cheat sheet for organizations to pledge to lift their standards. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's what I call the Workplace Promise. It's our campaign. It brings together these values of social justice, diversity, inclusion, employee engagement, continuous process improvement. What I developed was this brief way of having sort of this one-page proclamation, so it's easy to read and understand, that was based on work I did with the World Health Organization when I was working at the Pentagon, working on suicide prevention. And we were looking at a suicide prevention imperative that I contributed to. And then I was in Geneva in like 2016, actually, and worked on this toolkit. And the whole idea behind these toolkits is to make something easy and accessible for organizations to be able to have a toolkit, do what I call them signing ceremonies, like bring this actively into your organization, demonstrate leadership commitment, and then find ways to engage on these elements all year through. So if you're a bank, what do you do about mental health? It's Mental Health Awareness Month. Are you running something for your employees, for your customers, that talk about financial mental health? Why is that important? So that we can do these things that bring together these resilience skills and make the workplace somewhere where people feel safe, where they have a sense of belonging, and where they can feel self-efficacious and self-actualized in who they are and what they're contributing.
One of the powerful things that I've picked up from looking at the work of Whistleblowers of America and your background is your view that it needs to be integrated. So I've seen examples where well-being is done here, sustainability over here, diversity inclusion maybe somewhere else, and it clearly motivated people to work in all these areas. And it would seem that you would see speaking up again as not something to be done over here in a business, but across all these other parts of the business to get the best outcome for people.
Yeah, so we really want to encourage that collaboration, that recognition is there, that whistleblowing is part of your everyday, right? It should be part of every job description. We should want to hire whistleblowers. We should want to recognize them for their work. That's why we created something called the Giraffe Award, is to have that criteria so that organizations can nominate their employees, people can nominate their friends, their coworkers, their families. I've got these giraffes all around me. Here's the one that sits on my desk. So we created this idea for a Giraffe Award because whistleblowers stand tall and stick their necks out as a way of protecting other people. We risk criticism and anger. That's the definition of sticking your neck out. That's so important to having that moral courage, that moral compass, that sense of perspective, is that you embrace that and you do that as part of being a good organization, an organization of choice, you want your people to be giraffes. You want them to stick their necks out. We use the giraffe as our mascot as opposed to the whistle because we think that it embraces a much more positive role model for employees who want to do the right thing, and that we are really more of a beloved creature than a screeching whistle.
You've identified a range, and you call it a lexicon around whistleblowing too, that I think would be really useful for you to maybe talk about some of the key parts of it. So people who are listening, maybe I identify some things they haven't thought they are feeling themselves in relation to their angst about speaking up.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. When we talk about whistleblower retaliation, how do we start to codify that? How do we have a lexicon and a taxonomy around that that gives us a common set of definitions and understanding? Because until we can codify that, we can't begin to understand how to treat it or work with it. I've often compared it to understanding, what is a social worker? We understand what a social worker is because of scope of practice. We understand what diabetes is because it has a scope of practice surrounding it. So when we talk about retaliation, I've thought it really needs its own taxonomy and a way of understanding what is it and what does it look like. Because sometimes it's very overt. It's somebody has been terminated or they've been demoted, to these minor microaggressions where somebody is constantly having, the watch checking, the eye rolling, the boss who interrupts them, doesn't give them credit. So we decided to come up with a way to classify that. And so the first piece of that is we look at what is gaslighting. And I think I alluded to that earlier when I said that's what causes the ruminations, right? You're told you don't know what you're talking about. You're making too much of a big deal about it. It is that guarded sense of mobbing. It's when other people then start to engage. You see your boss constantly checking her watch while so-and-so is talking. You begin to devalue that person. Devaluing is when that person is not seen as credible as they once were. Their performance evaluations are marked lower. They are marginalized. So instead of being part of a team or in an office where they always were, they get moved away, shunted off to a different building, a trailer, a closet. They're just off and out of the team. They're left off of emails. They are marginalized away. I separated that a little bit from ostracizing and shunning, because when people are shunned, that's more that interpersonal. And I find that is where that sense of betrayal and lack of belongingness really is stronger. That's where people become really much more depressed, feel betrayed, anxious. That's the real life loss, because I had one person tell me, my best friend, when I asked her to stand up for me, wouldn't, and then avoided me, wouldn't have lunch with me anymore, would go the other way in a hallway. And this was a person that they had been at birthday parties and family weddings, celebrations together. And then all of a sudden that relationship went away. The double bind, feeling like your boss is going to give you a brand new work assignment and it's all going to be great, but then it lacks resources or time to actually accomplish the mission. Blocking, or what some people have traditionally called blacklisting, is that inability to connect with other hiring managers. You're person non grata in your field. You can't get another job. It becomes this spiral of not being able to practice professionally anymore. The accusations or counter accusations. So some of these other tactics feed that. It's why organizations will engage in mobbing, is because they've asked somebody to spy on somebody, and all of a sudden you're being counter accused of, well, you're not a really good performer, or your expense report wasn't turned in on time, your attendance sheet, all these things we find fault with after you've been gaslit or after you've been retaliated against because of your disclosure. And then finally, we talk about bullying. That is the actual emotional and physical violence that can come with being a whistleblower. And we've also expanded some of the bullying is also cyberbullying and doxing and swatting and all these things that happen in cyberspace is all comes under this bullying heading, because that's again where we see some of the real harm done. So we take those toxic tactics, and those are my 9 domains, and I can actually evaluate how those tactics can relate to somebody developing PTSD, depression, becoming suicidal, as well as some of those stress-related physical conditions like gastrointestinal diseases, autoimmune diseases, musculoskeletal diseases. A lot of those things are very much stress-related. So we can kind of really see how when you have a taxonomy for it, it starts to really paint a picture of what's really happening for somebody.
I can see from this a lot of value in both organizations understanding some of these ways it can manifest, because A, they have a duty, and B, some of the behaviors may be unconscious to a degree. They've just reacted negatively and haven't thought about the implications, and also incredibly beneficial to potential whistleblowers, people with stories to tell, because they can identify in themselves the problem. Putting it all together with support obviously is where Whistleblowers of America can come in to then bring the parties together to protect the people, get the good feedback, and also to allow businesses to grow and people not to be damaged through the process of it. Where do you see the place of legislation to support protection for whistleblowers?
So even in the US, that is a hodgepodge of rules, regulations, and laws, and circuit court decisions, and federal and Supreme Court decisions. And internationally, we know that there's legislation all over. I've talked to Whistleblowers UK, and they're working on some legislation that's brand new in the UK on having a whistleblower office. And I know the European Union has had a new directive on whistleblower protection. I've seen a Korean anti-corruption report that includes protections for whistleblowers. So I think there's a gamut of these things that are happening all over. In South Africa, the Zondo Commission comes to mind, and looking at how they can better handle whistleblowing and overcome what they call state capture. I think there are opportunities all over the world. I'm hoping everybody gets on board with doing this. I mean, I feel like there's a comparative track to what we've seen with combat trauma over the years. When we first recognized PTSD as a diagnosis in 1981, it had nothing to do with Americans and the uniforms Americans wore, or the uniforms of any other country. We began to recognize PTSD in combat veterans as being very universal. We recognized it in Holocaust survivors, in other mass casualty survivors. The model is replicable to other populations who have been traumatized by events that are beyond their control and that happen to them, and change and shatter their worldviews.
I get the sense with this, there is a momentum building that should always be a signal to businesses that if they don't take action themselves, there will be more forced ways for them to take action through regulation and legislation. Maybe to conclude, what would you see as things that organizations should be doing of their own volition to make sure retribution doesn't happen to their workers? And then secondary to that, some advice for people with their stories to tell, a couple of tips that you might leave our listeners with.
Sure. So, we encourage employers to make a workplace promise. We want you to be an organization of choice. We want you to have, these are difficult conversations sometimes to have, but if you do it in a transparent way and hold perpetrators accountable, those have to be real steps. We spend a lot of money on fighting whistleblowers. According to the UN, 5% of our GDP is lost to corruption globally. That's an incredible amount of money for any individual country to have to absorb. But when we think about it from a global perspective, and companies that operate in so many markets, that if they had a standard, if they held a standard and they fought corruption and they rewarded the people that brought mismanagement, corruption, fraud, waste, abuse, whatever you want to call it, if they brought it to the attention of those in the most senior leadership roles, and those people took it seriously and acted upon it, there would be less CEOs in jail, and there would be less corruption worldwide, and we'd have less trauma and harm that comes from this. And I think for the whistleblower themselves, I always tell them to be mindful of what is your employee handbook. Start with the most internal policies and procedures. Know what you can report to, know who you can report to, know if you're a federal employee, a state, local, who has control over your issue. Do your homework, do your research. Make sure then that you have the right evidence, know what a level of evidence is to connect your case. Be organized, have your timeline, have your org chart, your resume, be ready to talk to an attorney, be ready to talk to investigators, and know that what your family thinks. Talk to your family, because they're going to go through this with you, and if they're not prepared, it could cause a lot of harm and stress. I mean, we've seen all kinds of bad outcomes when whistleblowers aren't as prepared as they could be for what is about to happen next.
Jackie, I'd really like to thank you for your time and sharing these insights. They're going to be incredibly beneficial to organizations, governments even, and whistleblowers themselves. We'll put a couple of links up on this podcast through to Whistleblowers of America, because there'll be a lot of information there that can help people, which I guess is the whole reason for you doing what you do. So thank you very much for your time, and all the best to all the giraffes out there and the work of Whistleblowers of America.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed our conversation today.